I signed the paper because it meant my son could sleep at night, and because saying no would have made me the kind of mother people whisper about. It was a Tuesday morning, just after 9 a.m., and the kitchen was still warm from the coffee maker. He sat across from me, tapping his pen, telling me this was just for convenience. I noticed my name was spelled wrong on the second page. I didn't say anything. 2 weeks later, I learned convenience has a way of deciding who owns your life. I signed the paper because it meant my son could sleep at night, and because saying no would have made me the kind of mother people whisper about at church. It was a Tuesday, just after 9 in the morning, and the kitchen still smelled like burnt coffee from the machine I never quite learned to clean properly. The house was quiet in the way it gets after you've lived alone long enough to stop noticing the silence. He sat across from me at the table, tapping his pen against a yellow legal pad, telling me this was just for convenience. I remember thinking the word sounded harmless, convenient, like a closer parking spot, like buying pre-cut vegetables instead of whole ones. He said it would make things easier if something ever happened, if I slipped again, if I forgot to pay a bill, if my phone died and no one could reach me. He said it in the same calm voice he used when he was 12, and asking if he could stay out later than usual. I noticed my name was spelled wrong on the second page, one letter off. I didn't say anything. 2 weeks later, I would learn that convenience has a way of deciding who owns your life. That morning, I was wearing the gray sweatshirt with the frayed cuff, the one I used for chores, not company. He'd come by unannounced, which wasn't unusual anymore. Ever since I fell on the back steps in January, he'd made a habit of checking in, sometimes twice a day. The fall wasn't dramatic. No ambulance, no broken bones, just a bruise on my hip, the color of an overripe plum, and a soreness that took its time leaving. Still, it was enough to change the way he looked at me. Not worried, exactly, assessed. "Mom," he said, sliding the papers toward me. "This is just so I can help if you need it." I won. I nodded because nodding was easier than asking questions that might sound ungrateful. I'd spent most of my adult life feeding other people's children and listening to their small complaints about undercooked fries or too much ketchup. As the cafeteria manager at Lincoln Middle School, I learned early that keeping things running smoothly mattered more than being right. You show up, you solve the problem, you don't make a scene. That habit followed me home, followed me into motherhood, followed me into retirement. I raised him alone after his father left. There wasn't a dramatic blow-up, no police reports or slammed doors. His dad just packed a suitcase one morning and said he needed space. I filled the silence he left behind with routine. Work, homework, dinner, repeat. I made sure there was always food on the table and clean clothes in the closet. I learned how to stretch a dollar and how to keep my mouth shut when I was tired. I told myself that was what strength looked like. So when my son told me he was worried, that he lay awake at night thinking about me alone in this house, I felt a strange mix of pride and relief. Someone was thinking about me now. Someone was taking responsibility. I didn't stop to ask when that responsibility had quietly shifted hands. After he left that Tuesday, I rinsed my mug and set it upside down on the towel. The papers sat in a neat stack by the fruit bowl. I didn't file them away. I didn't read them again. I went out to the garage and tried to reorganize the shelves, moving boxes of old school supplies and mismatched Tupperware like it mattered. By noon, my hip was aching, and I sat on the step with a glass of water, watching dust float in the light. Later that week, my neighbor Carol waved at me from across the driveway. She asked how I was feeling, if my leg was better. I told her it was fine, because it mostly was. She said it was good my son was around so much. "You're lucky," she said. "Some kids don't bother." Lucky. I rolled the word around in my mouth like a mint. I had always been careful with money, careful with trust. I paid my bills on time, kept my receipts in a shoebox labeled by year. I still balanced my checkbook even after the bank told me no one did that anymore. Control, to me, meant safety. I didn't realize I'd started handing it over in small, reasonable pieces. The first thing I noticed missing was my utility bill reminder. Every month, like clockwork, I got an email and a paper notice. It was silly, but it comforted me. proof that things were moving along as expected. March came and went, and I didn't see it. I assumed I'd deleted the email by mistake. I assumed the post office was slow. Assumptions had always been easier than confrontation. Then my online banking looked different. I logged in one morning to check my balance before heading to the grocery store, and the screen took an extra second to load. When it did, one of my accounts wasn't there. The small savings account I kept for emergencies, the one I'd opened when he was born and never fully closed. I logged out and back in, my fingers stiff on the keyboard, still gone. I called the bank and waited on hold, listening to tinny music and a recorded voice thanking me for my patience. When a woman finally picked up, she asked for my information, then paused. "Are you calling with your authorized representative?" she asked. "My what?" I said. She repeated it, slower this time. "Authorized representative." I told her I was calling for myself. There was another pause, longer. She said she'd need to speak with the person listed on the account. I felt heat creep up my neck, the same heat I used to feel when a parent accused the lunch staff of shortchanging their kid. I hung up and stared at the phone like it had betrayed me. When my son called back that afternoon, cheerful and unhurried, I asked him about it. He laughed, light and quick. "Mom, that's what the papers were for, so I can help you with that stuff. You probably just forgot." Forgot. The word landed wrong, heavy where it shouldn't have been. I laughed too, because that's what you do when you don't want to argue. I told him it must be nice not to have to worry so much. He said it was, that he was glad to be useful. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle. The heater clicked on and off. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. I tried to remember signing the papers, the exact feel of the pen, the way the paper sounded when I slid it back across the table. I could picture the kitchen clearly, the smear of jam on the counter, the clock reading 9:17. But the act itself felt fuzzy, like a dream you're not sure you actually had. In the morning, I made oatmeal and ate it standing up, staring out the window at the bare tree in the yard. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself this was what getting older looked like, a gradual easing out of the driver's seat. Still, when I reached for my wallet before leaving the house, I checked twice to make sure it was there. I noticed my hand was shaking. I waited for it to stop, then locked the door behind me. I didn't know then that this was the last quiet morning I'd have in that house where everything still belonged to me, at least on paper. I didn't know that the things I'd trusted most routine, family, good intentions, were already rearranging themselves without my permission. All I knew was that something small had shifted, and I was standing in the middle of it, trying to convince myself that standing still counted as being safe. I've always been good at telling myself a story that makes things easier to live with. I learned that skill long before my son ever started showing up with folders and reassuring smiles. I learned it back when the cafeteria kitchen was still my second home, and I was waking up at 4:30 every morning to start boiling water for oatmeal that never quite stayed warm by the time the first bell rang. For 32 years, I worked in public schools, not as a teacher, not as someone whose name kids remembered years later, but as the woman behind the counter who knew which child needed an extra scoop and which one pretended not to be hungry because their lunch account was empty. I learned to read people quickly. You have to, when you're feeding hundreds of kids a day. You learn who's lying, who's embarrassed, who just needs to feel seen for 5 seconds before they grab their tray and disappear down the hall. That job taught me how to smooth things over, how to keep the line moving, how to solve problems quietly so no one felt exposed. If a freezer broke, you didn't panic. You adjusted the menu. If a delivery was late, you improvised. If a parent stormed in furious because their kid didn't like the pizza, you listened, apologized, and fixed it, even when you knew the real problem wasn't the food. I brought that same instinct home with me. When my marriage fell apart, I didn't talk about it much. People assumed there was a story, something dramatic, but there wasn't. My husband just stopped wanting to be there. One evening turned into many evenings, where he came home later and later, until one day he didn't come home at all. He left a note on the counter, said he needed a different life, said it wasn't anyone's fault. I stood in the kitchen reading those words over and over while my son watched cartoons in the living room, laughing at something I couldn't hear. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I made dinner. That was the beginning of me becoming the kind of woman who holds everything together by not asking too many questions. I picked up extra shifts. I learned how to stretch leftovers. I learned how to say, "It's fine," and mean, "I can handle this." I learned how to be tired without complaining, how to be scared without showing it, how to keep my son believing the world was stable even when I felt like it wasn't. So when people talk about me now, they use words like capable, independent, strong. They don't see the other side of it. The part where strength turns into habit, and habit turns into silence. The part where you start believing that needing help means you've failed at something you were supposed to manage alone. Raising my son became my proof that I'd done something right. I showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every basketball game, every awkward band recital where he played the trumpet a little too loudly. I packed his lunches until he asked me to stop because it embarrassed him. I worked holidays and summers so he could go to camp and feel like a normal kid. When he left for college, I stood in his empty room and cried for exactly 1 hour, then went back to work the next day. I told myself that was the deal. You give, and eventually, you let go. After I retired, life slowed down in ways I wasn't prepared for. The days stretched out, quiet and unstructured. I filled them with routines, because routines made me feel useful. Monday was laundry. Tuesday was grocery shopping. Wednesday was volunteering at the food pantry. I went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew I'd sat in for years. People asked how I liked retirement. I said it was nice. That was mostly true. I didn't mind being alone. I minded feeling unnecessary. When I slipped on the back steps that winter, it felt like a fluke. A patch of ice I hadn't noticed. A misjudged step. But the bruise lingered, and so did my son's reaction. He came over with groceries I hadn't asked for, replaced a light bulb that didn't need replacing, checked the smoke detectors twice. He asked if I'd been dizzy. He asked if I was eating enough. He asked if I'd thought about what might happen down the line. At first, it felt like care. Real, attentive care. The kind I'd spent years giving out without expecting much in return. It felt good to be on the receiving end of concern instead of obligation. I didn't question it because questioning it would have felt ungrateful. He started framing things as teamwork. "We should handle this together," he'd say. "Let me take that off your plate." He talked about how busy his life was, how stressful his job had become, but still found time to check on me. I told myself that was love. I told myself I'd done something right if my child worried about me. What I didn't notice, or didn't want to notice, was how often the word "we" really meant him. He began answering questions for me when we were together. If a neighbor asked how I was feeling, he'd say, "She's doing much better," before I could answer. If someone asked about my plans, he'd say, "We're still figuring that out." It was subtle enough that I brushed it off. I'd spent my whole life letting louder voices take the lead. This felt familiar. The paperwork came next, tucked into normal conversations. Insurance updates, emergency contacts, just-in-case forms. He'd say things like, "This is what everyone does," and I believed him because I didn't want to admit how little I knew about the way things worked once you crossed a certain age. No one prepares you for that part. They prepare you for college, for marriage, for retirement, but not for the moment when people start talking to you like you're a future problem that needs organizing. I trusted him because he was my son. Because I'd raised him. Because the alternative was believing I might need protection from the person I'd spent my life protecting. Looking back, I can see how neatly it all fit together, how my history made me the perfect candidate for being managed without resistance. I was used to stepping back, used to believing that harmony mattered more than control, used to thinking that good intentions canceled out bad outcomes. At the time, none of it felt like a threat. It felt like a continuation of the same story I'd been telling myself for decades. I take care of others, and when I can't, they take care of me. That was the bargain. That was the moral math I'd always lived by. What I didn't understand yet was that care and control can wear the same face. That being helpful doesn't always mean being harmless, and that the habits that keep you afloat for years can quietly become the reason you start sinking, one small, reasonable decision at a time. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They slipped into my days the way dust settles on furniture when you're not looking, thin and even, until one day you run your finger across a surface and realize how long it's been building up. If anyone had asked me then whether something was wrong, I would have said no, without hesitation. Nothing felt broken, nothing felt urgent, it just felt different in ways that were easy to explain away. My son started calling earlier in the mornings, not to chat, not to check in, but to remind me of things. Doctor appointments I already had written down. Trash day, the password to the streaming service he'd set up for me because he said cable was a waste of money. He spoke slowly, clearly, like he was being considerate. I thanked him every time, even when the reminder landed with a dull weight in my chest, like a suggestion I hadn't asked for. When my phone rang now, it was usually him. If it wasn't, and I mentioned the call later, he'd ask who it was. Not suspiciously, casually. Just so I know, he'd say. I told myself that was normal, that's what family does, keeps track of each other. Still, I found myself pausing before answering questions that used to come easily. What did I do yesterday? Who did I talk to? The answers were simple, but saying them felt like reporting. One afternoon, I drove myself to the pharmacy to pick up a refill. I'd been going to the same place for years. The cashier recognized me, asked how I was doing. I said fine. When I handed over my insurance card, she frowned at the screen. "We need to verify something," she said, and disappeared into the back. I waited, leaning on the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerators behind me. When she came back, she asked if my son was with me. I said no. She said she'd need to call him anyway. "It's just policy," she added quickly, like she could see the confusion rising in my face. I stood there while she dialed a number I hadn't given her. My son answered on the second ring. She spoke to him quietly, nodded, then handed me my bag with a practiced smile. On the drive home, I told myself it was nothing. Insurance changes, new systems. I'd never been good with that stuff anyway. Still, I turned the radio off and drove the rest of the way in silence, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. At home, I checked my email. There were fewer messages than usual. No reminder from the electric company. No notice from the bank about my statement being ready. I searched my inbox, then my spam folder. Nothing. I told myself companies were cutting back on paper and notifications. I told myself the world was moving faster than I could keep up with, and that was okay. That night, my son came over with takeout. He'd already ordered, already chosen. "I know what you like," he said, handing me a container. I did like it, or at least, I used to. We ate at the table where we'd signed the papers weeks before. He talked about his job, about deadlines and meetings and how exhausted he'd been. I listened, nodding, asking the right questions, the way I always had. When I mentioned the pharmacy, he waved it off. "They're just being careful," he said. "You know how it is." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm just trying to make sure nothing slips through the cracks." I smiled, because that was what you do when someone says they're protecting you. But later, when I stood at the sink washing the containers, I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd asked me what I wanted for dinner. The first time he answered a call for me, I was in the bathroom. I heard my phone ringing in the living room, and then his voice, muffled through the wall. I finished washing my hands and stepped out just as he hung up. "Spam," he said quickly. "I took care of it." I laughed and said thanks. But the word "took care of" stayed with me, looping in my mind as I went about the rest of the day. It wasn't that I minded help. It was that I hadn't asked. Little decisions started being made without me. A maintenance appointment for the house scheduled on a day I'd planned to be out. A credit card replaced because, according to him, the old one was outdated. When I asked about it, He said he'd already handled the details. "It's easier this way," he said. "Trust me." Trust had never felt like a risk before. It felt like a default setting. I trusted teachers, doctors, coworkers. I trusted systems. I trusted that if something was wrong, it would announce itself loudly enough that I couldn't miss it. But this wasn't loud. It was quiet and orderly and wrapped in concern. One evening, I sat down with my checkbook, the way I still did out of habit. I wrote the date at the top of the page, then stopped. The numbers didn't line up the way I expected. Not drastically, nothing alarming, just enough to make me pause. I flipped back a few pages, tracing entries with my finger. I couldn't find the transfer I was looking for. The one I made every month, without fail. I told myself I must have moved it online. I told myself I was tired. I closed the checkbook and put it back in the drawer. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in the dark listening to the tick of the clock in the hallway. Each second felt louder than the last. I thought about the forms I'd signed, the way my son's pen had moved confidently across the page, pointing where I should sign, flipping to the next section before I'd finished reading the one before it. I thought about how often I'd said, "Whatever you think is best." In the morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied my face. The lines around my eyes were deeper than I remembered, or maybe I was just paying closer attention. I lifted my chin, tested my balance, smiled at my reflection. I didn't look confused. I didn't feel lost. But something in my chest tightened as I realized how quickly other people had decided I might be. That day, I wrote a list, not of errands or chores, but of things I knew to be true. My address, my social security number, the name of my bank, the name of the school where I'd worked for 3 decades. It felt silly, like a test I was giving myself, but I filled the page anyway. When I was done, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my purse. I didn't know what I was preparing for. I just knew that the ground beneath me felt slightly uneven now, like a step you think is there until your foot hits air. No one had pushed me. No one had raised their voice. Yet somewhere between convenience and care, I had started to feel like a guest in my own life, smiling politely while decisions happened just out of reach. The moment everything shifted didn't come with an argument or a raised voice. It came on a Thursday afternoon, under fluorescent lights, with a polite woman on the phone who kept apologizing for an inconvenience she didn't seem to understand herself. I was sitting at the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I'd bought secondhand years ago, and never bothered to replace. I had a stack of envelopes spread out in front of me, most of them already opened and sorted into neat piles. Bills paid, junk mail recycled, a few church flyers set aside for later. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon I'd always trusted, the kind where nothing bad was supposed to happen. I dialed the number on my bank statement because I wanted to ask about the missing account. I told myself it was probably a clerical error, something simple. I waded through the automated menu, pressing buttons I'd pressed dozens of times before, until a human voice finally came on the line. She asked for my name. I gave it. She asked for my date of birth. I gave her that too. She paused, typing, then asked if my authorized representative was available. "I don't have one," I said, a little sharper than I meant to. There was another pause. I could hear papers rustling on her end, a keyboard clicking. "According to our records, you do," she said carefully. "We'll need to speak with him to make any changes." "Him," I repeated. My voice sounded far away to my own ears. She gave me my son's name without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She said it kindly, like she was helping me remember something obvious. I felt heat spread across my face, then drain away, leaving me cold. "I am calling for myself," I said. "I am sitting in my own house. I know who I am." "I understand," she said quickly. Too quickly. "It's just the way the account is set up." I asked her when that had changed. She told me the date. I looked down at my calendar, the one hanging by the fridge with handwritten notes in blue ink. That date meant nothing to me. No appointment, no visit, no memory attached to it at all. When I hung up, the room felt smaller. The walls hadn't moved, but the air had thickened, like before a storm. I sat there for a long time with the phone in my hand, staring at the blank screen. I tried to remember signing something on that day. Tried to picture where I'd been, what I'd been wearing, whether I'd had coffee that morning. The harder I tried, the more slippery the memory became. I called my son. He answered on the first ring, cheerful as always. "Hey, Mom." I told him what the bank had said. I tried to keep my tone light, like I was asking about a recipe or the weather. There was a brief silence on the line, just long enough for me to notice it. "Oh, that," he said. "Yeah, that's part of what we set up. You signed for it, remember?" "No," I said. "I don't remember." He laughed softly, not unkindly. "Mom, that's why we did it. You were worried about forgetting things." The words hit me harder than I expected. Worried. Forgetting. I stood up and walked to the window, pressing my free hand against the glass like it could steady me. "I don't forget my bank accounts," I said. "Well," he replied, still calm, "you didn't forget them. You just wanted help managing them." There it was, a version of events delivered with such confidence that for a split second, I wondered if he was right. If I had said something and then erased it from my own mind. If this was what it felt like to start losing pieces of yourself without realizing it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "I did," he said immediately. "We talked about it. You said it was fine." After we hung up, I went to the hallway closet and pulled down the old accordion folder where I kept important papers. It was heavy in my hands, the cardboard worn soft at the edges from years of use. I spread its contents across the bed. Tax returns, insurance statements, warranty manuals for appliances I no longer owned. I flipped through each section carefully, methodically. I found the copy of the document he'd had me sign. It was there, tucked between a medical bill and a retirement statement. My signature sat at the bottom of the page, neat and familiar. No shakiness, no hesitation, just my name, written the way I'd written it for decades. The date matched what the bank had told me. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held the paper in my lap. My signature was proof. That was the part that scared me most, not that someone had forged it, but that I'd signed something without understanding what it meant, without even remembering doing it later, that I'd trusted the wrong part of myself at the wrong time. For the rest of the day, I moved through the house like I was visiting it for the first time. I opened drawers, checked cabinets, touched things just to confirm they were still where I'd left them. Everything looked the same. Everything felt different. When my son stopped by that evening, I watched him more closely than I ever had before. The way he glanced at his phone while I talked, the way he positioned himself between me and the paperwork on the counter, casually, without thinking. He asked if I'd eaten. I said yes, even though I hadn't. He mentioned, almost offhandedly, that we should start thinking about the future, about options, about places that might be easier for me. He said it gently, like a suggestion. I nodded, because nodding was still my reflex. After he left, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding in a way I couldn't ignore. I wasn't afraid of getting older. I was afraid of disappearing while still standing in the room. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down every date I could remember from the past 3 months. Doctor visits, church events, grocery trips. I compared them to the paperwork, the transactions, the changes I was only just learning about. The lists didn't line up. For the first time, the question I'd been avoiding took shape in my mind, clear and undeniable. What if this wasn't about helping me at all? I didn't say it out loud. I didn't accuse anyone. I folded the paper, slid it into the same purse where I kept the list of things I knew to be true, and turned off the light. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I understood something I hadn't before. Whatever I thought my life was, whatever role I believed I was playing in it, someone else had already started editing the script. And if I didn't pay attention now, I wouldn't recognize the ending when it arrived. For a few days after that realization settled in, I did nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to move too quickly. Panic has a way of making you loud and sloppy, and I had spent a lifetime learning how to survive by being quiet and precise. So I watched. I listened. I paid attention to the spaces between what was said and what was done. I started with myself. That was the hardest part. I needed to know, with absolute certainty, whether I could still trust my own mind. The idea that I might not be able to was more frightening than any paperwork or bank account. If my memory was unreliable, then everything else was already lost. Each morning, I wrote down the date and time on a small notepad I kept by the bed. I wrote what I planned to do that day, in plain language. Grocery store, call Carol, water plants. In the evening, I went back to the list and checked each item off, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to myself. I wanted evidence that my days still belonged to me. I began keeping receipts again, not tossed into a drawer, but laid out neatly on the desk. I noted the time I left the house and the time I returned. I checked my phone's call log and compared it to what I remembered. Everything lined up. There were no missing hours, no gaps, no fog. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made something else painfully clear. If I wasn't losing track of my life, then someone else was tracking it for me. My son continued to call, continued to stop by, continued to speak in that steady, reassuring tone that now felt rehearsed. He asked questions that sounded like concern but landed like audits. Had I taken my medication? Had I slept well? Had I paid the water bill yet? Or should he handle it? I answered carefully, neutrally, the way you do when you're not sure how much information is safe to give. At church on Sunday, I sat beside Carol and sang hymns I'd known by heart for years. My voice didn't shake. My mind didn't wander. After the service, people chatted in the aisle, the usual small talk about weather and grandchildren. Someone asked if I'd be going on the fall retreat again this year. Before I could answer, my son stepped in. "She's not sure yet," he said. "We're seeing how things go." I smiled at the woman and nodded, even as something twisted in my stomach. Seeing how things go. As if I weren't standing right there, capable of deciding whether I wanted to spend a weekend at a retreat I'd attended every year for a decade. That afternoon, I went home and stood in the hallway, staring at the framed photos on the wall. My son at 5, missing 2 front teeth. My son at 18, awkward in his graduation gown. My son at 30, standing beside me at my retirement party, his arm around my shoulders, proud and smiling. I searched those faces for some sign I'd missed, some warning that the child I'd raised would grow into someone who spoke for me instead of to me. The doubt crept in quietly. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just what it felt like to hand over the reins after a lifetime of holding them tight. Maybe my pride was getting in the way of necessary help. I'd always believed that love meant sacrifice. Hadn't I taught him that? But another thought followed close behind, sharper and harder to ignore. Sacrifice is supposed to be voluntary. You're supposed to know what you're giving up. That night, I pulled the old journals from the bottom drawer of my dresser. I'd never been a consistent writer, but over the years, I'd filled a few notebooks with scattered thoughts, lists, reminders. I flipped through them slowly, reading entries from years ago. Notes about my son's first apartment, about the day I paid off the house, about the relief I felt when I finally retired and didn't have to wake up before dawn. The handwriting was steady throughout. The voice was mine, practical, clear. I wasn't reading the words of someone who drifted through her life unaware of her choices. I slept poorly, waking up every hour, my mind circling the same questions. In the early morning, when the house was quiet and the world felt suspended, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't confront him yet. Confrontation would give him the chance to explain things away, to tell me again that I'd agreed, that I'd forgotten, that this was for my own good. Instead, I would gather facts. Facts didn't argue. They didn't get emotional. They just existed. I began calling places on my own, using the numbers I found on old statements and documents. The insurance company, the utilities, the retirement office. Each call followed the same pattern. I introduced myself. I answered their questions. And then, almost inevitably, they asked if my son was available. Sometimes they refused to speak to me beyond basic information. Sometimes they spoke slowly, as if I might not follow. Once, a man asked me to verify my identity by answering a security question I'd never set. When I said so, he told me it must have been updated recently. Recently. That word echoed in my head long after the call ended. With each conversation, the picture sharpened. My son wasn't just helping. He was positioned everywhere, on accounts, on forms, on permissions I didn't remember granting, not hidden, not secretive, but visible enough that anyone looking from the outside would assume it was normal, necessary, even responsible. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all looked on paper. No large withdrawals, no reckless spending, just small shifts in authority, neatly documented and legally sound. If I tried to explain my unease to someone else, I could already hear how it would sound. An older woman uncomfortable with change, a mother struggling to accept help, nothing anyone would rush to defend. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, I didn't really feel like eating. My son called. He told me he'd scheduled a cognitive screening for me. Just routine, he said. Something his coworker had mentioned. It'll put everyone's mind at ease, he added, as if that settled it. My mind is at ease, I said, before I could stop myself. There was a pause. Mom, he said gently, there's no harm in checking. After we hung up, I sat down hard in the chair, my heart racing. A screening, a test, a formal record that could turn suspicion into certainty in the eyes of other people. For the first time, I saw how easily the story could be completed without my participation. All it would take was one professional opinion, one note in a file, and the rest would follow naturally. That was the moment the fear crystallized into something else. Determination, maybe, or clarity. I wasn't confused. I wasn't helpless. But if I didn't act soon, I would be treated as if I were. I folded the napkin in my lap carefully, smoothing the creases the way I always did. My hands were steady, my thoughts were sharp. And for the first time since that Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, I stopped asking myself what I had forgotten and started asking a different question. What was being taken from me while I was busy proving I still deserved to keep it? By the time I reached that question, I already knew I couldn't answer it from memory alone. Memory was too easy to doubt, too easy for someone else to dismiss. What I needed was something firmer. Paper, dates, numbers that didn't care how old I was or how calm I sounded on the phone. Facts had weight. Facts stayed where you put them. I cleared the dining table the next morning and laid out everything I could find. Bank statements, insurance letters, tax documents, a few envelopes I hadn't opened yet because I didn't recognize the sender. I worked slowly, the way I always had, sorting piles the same way I used to sort food orders at school. Proteins here, produce there. Nothing rushed, nothing emotional. The first thing I noticed was how many things were no longer addressed directly to me. My name was still there, but it shared space now, in care of, attention. Small phrases that shifted ownership without announcing themselves. I traced them with my finger, feeling foolish for not noticing sooner. It wasn't that they'd taken my name away. They'd simply placed it beside someone else's. I logged into my retirement account using the old password I'd written down years ago. It still worked. The balance was mostly what I expected, but the activity tab told a different story. Small withdrawals, not enough to raise alarms. Not enough to feel like theft, regular enough to look intentional. I clicked through the details, heart beating faster with each page. The money wasn't going into my checking account. I stared at the screen, reading the destination over and over, a line of text that might as well have been in another language. I copied it down exactly, letter by letter, onto the legal pad I'd started using for notes. I didn't call my son. I didn't tell myself there was an explanation. I just kept going. Next was the house. The deed was still in my name. That much was clear. But when I pulled my credit report, something new appeared. A line I didn't recognize. A home equity account opened months earlier. The amount was modest, far less than the house was worth, but it was there, active, drawing interest. My hands went cold as I scrolled. I had never applied for a home equity loan. I didn't need one. I paid my bills. I lived simply. I hadn't remodeled or replaced anything major in years. There was no reason for it to exist. I sat back in the chair and let the room come back into focus. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the normal sounds of a house that, until recently, I believed was entirely mine. I pressed my palm flat against the table and waited for the panic to come. It didn't. What I felt instead was a steady, unsettling clarity. This wasn't about forgetfulness. This wasn't about me being unable to manage my life. This was about access. I spent the rest of the day making calls, careful ones. I didn't accuse. I didn't reveal how much I already knew. I asked questions the way someone curious would ask them, not someone alarmed. With each answer, the pattern became harder to ignore. Yes, your son is listed. Yes, he's authorized. Yes, changes were made with proper documentation. No, there's nothing illegal here. That word again. Legal. It settled over everything like a lid. Late in the afternoon, I drove to the bank branch instead of calling. I wanted to sit across from someone. I wanted to be seen. The young man who helped me introduced himself and asked how he could assist. I told him I was trying to understand my accounts. I didn't mention my son at first. He pulled everything up on his screen, scrolling with practiced ease. I watched his face change, just slightly. Not alarmed, not concerned, just attentive. "Do you remember setting this up?" he asked, pointing. "I remember signing something," I said carefully. "I don't remember this." He nodded, slow and professional. He explained the structure, the permissions, the way authority could be shared without ownership changing hands. He used words like safeguard and oversight. I listened, nodding, letting him finish. "And the funds?" I asked. "Where do they go?" He told me, confirmed what I'd already seen. Then he hesitated, just for a second, before adding, "This is usually done when someone anticipates future care expenses." Anticipates. Future. Care. I thanked him and left with a folder tucked under my arm, my posture straight, my steps measured. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't call anyone. I drove home the long way, past streets I knew by heart, past the elementary school where I used to vote, past the grocery store where the cashier still called me honey. That evening, my son came by as usual. He asked how my day had been. I said fine. He asked if I'd made any progress on the paperwork I'd mentioned earlier. I said I was looking into it. He smiled, relieved, as if that was the right answer. We sat in the living room, the television on but muted. He talked about his work, about a coworker who was dealing with her parents' decline, about how hard it was to watch someone lose independence. He spoke gently, sympathetically, his voice full of understanding. I watched him while he spoke, the familiar gestures, the expressions I'd known his whole life. Nothing about him looked cruel. Nothing about him sounded malicious. That was the hardest part. If he'd been angry, if he'd raised his voice or demanded something outright, I might have recognized the threat sooner. Instead, he framed everything as necessity, as inevitability. "You don't want to be caught unprepared," he said. "I just want to make sure everything's in place." "In place for who?" I asked, before I could stop myself. He blinked, surprised, then recovered quickly. "For you, Mom. For us." Us, again. After he left, I locked the door and sat in the dark, the folder from the bank open on my lap. Page after page of neatly printed confirmation. No lies, no forgeries. Just a system that worked exactly as designed, assuming the person at the center of it was no longer the primary decision maker. That was when I understood the true shape of the danger. Not that I was being robbed, not that someone was stealing from me outright, but that my life was being slowly reorganized around the assumption that I would eventually stop objecting. The money, the house, the permissions. All of it pointed toward a future where my role would be limited to compliance, where my signature would matter less than my silence, where my consent would be implied rather than asked for. I closed the folder and set it aside. I didn't need to read it again. I already knew enough. This wasn't a mistake to be corrected. It wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up with a conversation. It was a plan that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, counting on my reluctance to make trouble. And, for the first time since this all began, I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I started wondering how much time I had left before someone else decided the rest for me. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't the restless, panicked kind of sleeplessness I'd expected. It was quieter than that. My mind moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had finally found something solid to push against. Every so often, I would get up, walk through the house, and touch something just to remind myself it was real. The back of a chair, the edge of the counter, the door frame where I'd marked my son's height years ago in pencil, the lines still faintly visible under a coat of paint. By morning, I knew what I needed to do next. I needed someone who had no emotional stake in my life, someone whose job was to look at facts without caring how they made anyone feel. I needed a professional who wouldn't soften the truth or dress it up as concern. I called an elder law attorney whose card I'd found in a brochure at the community center months earlier and never thought I'd need. Her office was across town, in a low brick building with a small parking lot and a sign that listed services in neat, reassuring letters. Planning, protection, advocacy. The words felt heavier now than they had when I first read them. Her assistant scheduled me for the following afternoon. Until then, I kept my routine intact. I watered the plants. I folded laundry. I answered my son's calls with the same calm voice I'd always used. He didn't need to know anything yet. The less he knew, the clearer my view would be. The attorney's office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. She was a woman around my age, maybe a little younger, with short hair and sharp eyes that missed very little. She didn't rush me. She didn't interrupt. She listened while I laid out everything I'd discovered, every document, every date, every small shift that had brought me here. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Let's look at the paperwork," she said. We went through it piece by piece. The medical authorization, the financial permissions, the equity line. She explained the language in plain terms, stripping away the polite phrasing and legal padding. She didn't tell me I was confused. She didn't tell me my son was acting out of love. She told me exactly what the documents allowed and, just as importantly, what they did not require. "You weren't incapacitated when you signed this," she said. "There's no indication you lacked capacity." "That's what I thought," I said. She nodded. "Which means this isn't fraud, it's consent." The word landed heavily between us. She didn't stop there. She asked about timing, about my fall, about who had suggested the forms, about whether I'd had independent advice at the time. I answered honestly, even when it made my chest tighten. When she was done, she looked at me for a long moment. "What concerns me," she said finally, "is the pattern. This was done in stages. Slowly. That doesn't make it illegal, but it does make it intentional." Intentional. Another word that refused to soften. She explained my options. I could revoke the authorizations. I could freeze accounts. I could demand an accounting. I could confront my son directly and insist on changes. Each option came with consequences, both legal and personal. She didn't sugarcoat that part. "If you move forward," she said, "this will change your relationship." "I think it already has," I replied. She gave a small, sympathetic smile. That's usually the case. Before I left, she handed me a checklist. Practical steps, phone calls to make, forms to sign. Nothing dramatic. Just a series of actions that, taken together, would shift control back where it belonged. In my hands. I drove home feeling strangely steady. Not relieved, not triumphant, just steady, like someone who had finally stopped drifting and put their feet down on solid ground. That evening, I made a simple dinner and ate it alone at the kitchen table. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't distract myself. I let the quiet settle. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt honest. My son called after dinner. He asked how the bank visit had gone. I told him I was still sorting things out. He sounded satisfied with that answer, which told me everything I needed to know. Over the next few days, the last piece fell into place almost by accident. I was going through an old file drawer, looking for the deed to the house, when I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside were copies of emails printed out, the kind you print when you want a record. They were between my son and a financial planner I'd never met. The dates matched the early stages of everything I'd been uncovering. I sat down on the floor and read them slowly. They weren't cruel. They weren't mocking. They were methodical. Discussions of long-term planning, of managing assets, of preparing for inevitable decline. My name appeared often, always attached to phrases like resistant to change and emotionally attached to independence. End quote. One line stood out more than the rest. Once the structure is in place, she won't need to be involved in day-to-day decisions. I read it twice, then a third time. There it was. Not suspicion, not interpretation, not fear, evidence, not of theft or malice, but of a decision already made about my role in my own life. A future where my involvement was optional, my consent assumed rather than sought. I sat there for a long time, the papers spread around me, feeling something settle deep in my chest. It wasn't rage, it wasn't grief, it was recognition. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better communication. This wasn't a well-meaning son who'd gone a little too far. This was a plan built on the belief that I would eventually stop resisting, because I always had before. I gathered the papers and placed them back in the envelope, then carried it to the desk and added it to the growing stack of documents. It didn't feel like a betrayal in the dramatic sense. It felt colder than that, like being quietly written out of your own story. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't replay conversations or second-guess myself. I didn't wonder if I was imagining things. The evidence had done what evidence does best. It removed doubt. By the time the sun rose, I was no longer asking whether something wrong was happening. I was asking myself a different question, one that felt both terrifying and necessary. What would it take to take my life back without becoming the villain in someone else's version of the story? I didn't wake up that morning feeling brave. I woke up feeling careful. There's a difference, and I knew it mattered. Bravery can be loud. Carefulness keeps you alive. I followed the checklist the attorney had given me, exactly as written. No improvising, no emotional edits, just steps. The first call was to the bank. I asked for the department that handled authorizations and powers. I spoke slowly, clearly, the way I'd learned to do when I needed people to take me seriously without feeling challenged. I said I wanted to revoke access, all access, effective immediately. There was a pause on the line, the sound of keys clicking. The woman asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked if I understood the consequences. I said I did. She explained the forms that would be emailed, the timeline, the confirmation process. I thanked her and wrote everything down in block letters, date and time at the top of the page. When I hung up, my hands were still steady. Next was the retirement account, then the insurance company, then the utilities. Each call followed the same pattern: verification, explanation, a brief moment where someone seemed surprised I was speaking for myself, then acceptance. Systems don't argue with certainty, they just require it. By noon, my inbox was full of confirmation emails. Each one felt like a small door closing quietly, not slammed, not locked with drama, just shut. I printed every message and added it to the folder. The stack was getting thicker now, heavier, like it had earned its weight. I didn't tell my son any of this. Not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I didn't want to give him time to redirect the narrative. I knew how easily he could frame this as confusion or fear if he caught it early. Silence, I'd learned, can be a form of protection when used deliberately. That afternoon, I drove to the attorney's office again. We reviewed the revocations together. She nodded as each confirmation came in. Good, she said. Now we wait for the dust to settle. Will he be notified? I asked. Eventually, she said. Not immediately. That's standard. I exhaled slowly. That window mattered more than I could explain. Before I left, she brought up the equity line. That would require a separate process, more forms, a formal request to close or restructure it. It would take time, she warned. I said I understood. Time, I was learning, could work in my favor too. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store. It felt important to do something ordinary, something that reminded me the world hadn't narrowed to paperwork and quiet fear. I pushed the cart slowly through the aisles, choosing vegetables, comparing prices. No one was watching me. No one was guiding my choices. That small freedom felt larger than it should have. That evening, my son came by. He didn't knock the way he used to. He never had. He just let himself in, calling my name as he crossed the threshold. I noticed it then, how natural that had become, how rarely I'd questioned it. He looked around, taking in the quiet house, the lack of papers on the table. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, I said. It was the truth. He sat down across from me, the same spot at the kitchen table where this had all begun. He asked if I'd heard back from the bank. I said I had. He smiled, relieved, and launched into a story about his day, about meetings and deadlines and stress. I listened, nodding in the right places, asking the right questions. I'd had a lot of practice doing that. At one point, he reached for my phone where it sat on the counter. Let me see something, he said casually. I slid it closer to myself instead. What do you need? He paused, just for a second. I was just going to check the calendar, make sure we didn't miss anything. I said, lightly. I've got it covered. His smile tightened. Mom, you don't have to. I know, I said. I want to. The moment passed, but something had shifted. He felt it too. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his eyes lingered on me a beat longer than usual, assessing. After he left, I locked the door behind him. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the deadbolt, listening to his footsteps fade. My heart was beating fast now, but not out of fear, out of anticipation. 2 days later, the first call came. He didn't start with anger. He started with confusion. Mom, the bank says there's been a change on your account. Yes, I said. Did you ask for that? Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Why? I could have explained. I could have listed everything I'd learned, every document, every line that had stripped me of agency, without saying so outright. But explanations invite arguments, and I wasn't here to debate my own autonomy. I'm more comfortable handling things myself, I said. That's not what we agreed on, he replied, his voice still calm, but tighter now. I don't remember agreeing to stop being involved in my own life, I said. He sighed, the sound heavy with patience. Mom, this is exactly what I was worried about. You're getting upset over nothing. Nothing. The word felt almost quaint. I'm not upset, I said. I'm informed. The line went quiet. When he spoke again, the warmth had thinned. You should have talked to me first. I did, I said softly. You just didn't hear me. He came over later that week, unannounced. I didn't invite him in right away. I spoke to him through the open door, the chain still on. His eyes flicked to it, then back to my face. You don't trust me now? He asked. I trust myself, I said. He looked hurt. Maybe he was. I didn't try to fix it. Over the next few days, the consequences began to ripple outward. Calls from companies went directly to me. Emails arrived in my inbox again, addressed only to my name. The house felt quieter, but also larger, like I'd reclaimed rooms I hadn't realized were closed off. There were moments when doubt crept back in, when I wondered if I'd gone too far, too fast, when I pictured the version of myself other people might see if he chose to tell the story his way. A worried son, an aging mother, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But then I would open the folder and read the emails again. She won't need to be involved. The words were still there, unchanged. I wasn't taking revenge. I wasn't punishing him. I was removing myself from a system that had decided I was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be consulted. That distinction mattered. One evening, as the sun set and the house filled with soft light, I sat at the kitchen table and realized something else. For the first time in months, no one else knew what decisions I'd made that day. No one was monitoring, adjusting, approving. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was mine. The confrontation, when it finally came, was smaller than I'd imagined. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a conversation that could have passed for ordinary if you didn't listen too closely to what was being said, or to what wasn't. My son asked to come over on a Sunday afternoon. His tone was careful, polite, the way people sound when they want something but don't want to say it outright. I agreed. I spent the morning doing the kind of quiet tasks that keep your hands busy and your mind steady. I changed the sheets. I wiped down the counters. I set 2 mugs on the table, even though I already knew I wouldn't drink much. He arrived on time. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, like he was recalibrating. I noticed then that he hadn't brought anything with him. No groceries, no folders, no pretense of errands, just himself. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where this had all started. Sunlight came in through the window, catching the edge of the placemat. It was almost peaceful. I got some notifications, he began. About the accounts. Yes, I said. You didn't tell me you were doing that. I didn't need permission. He nodded slowly, as if conceding a point he didn't fully accept. I just don't understand why you'd shut me out like this. The word shut felt deliberate, like I'd closed a door on him rather than stepped back into my own space. I didn't shut you out, I said. I stepped back in. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Mom, everything I did was to help you. You know that. I know that's how you see it, I replied. He frowned, not in anger, but in frustration. Then what's the problem? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I wanted to be precise. Careless words could be turned into something else later. The problem, I said, is that decisions about my life were being made without me. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That's not fair. You agreed to it. I agreed to help, I said. I didn't agree to disappear. He exhaled sharply. You're being dramatic. There it was. The word people reach for when they want to shrink a concern without addressing it. I'm being specific, I said. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. You're focusing on details instead of the big picture. I was trying to protect you. From what? I asked. From things getting worse, he said. From not being able to keep up. From making mistakes. I've made mistakes my whole life, I said. That's how I got here. He didn't smile at that. You're not seeing this clearly, he said. Everyone I talked to said this was the right way to handle it. Everyone except me, I said. Silence settled between us. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and stopped. I didn't think you'd react like this, he said finally. I didn't think you'd plan my future without me, I replied. That was the moment something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not guilt. Something closer to disappointment, but turned outward. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? He asked. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so revealing. How it makes you look to who? I asked. To people, he said. To the bank, to the planner, to my wife. You make it seem like I was doing something wrong. Were you? I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was measured. I did what needed to be done. Needed by whom? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You're twisting this. No, I said. I'm untwisting it. We sat there, facing each other across years of unspoken assumptions. I saw then how deeply he believed his own version of events, How reasonable it all sounded in his head. How certain he was that love gave him the right to decide. "I gave up a lot for you," he said suddenly. "So did I replied. "That's not the same," he said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." His jaw tightened. "You're throwing away help you're going to need." "I'm choosing when to accept it," I said. "That's not practical. It's human. He stood up then, pushing his chair back harder than necessary. "You're making a mistake," he said. "And when it backfires, don't expect me to clean it up." I looked up at him, really looked, at the man I'd raised, at the certainty in his eyes that caring and controlling were the same thing. "I'm not asking you to clean anything up," I said. "I'm asking you to respect that this is my life." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You always think you know best." "I want to. I know what's mine," I said. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the door. He paused there, hand on the knob. "You're pushing me away," he said, not turning around. "I'm standing where I belong," I replied. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No slam, no finality, just a sound you could easily miss if you weren't listening for it. I stayed at the table long after he left, my mug untouched, the sunlight shifting across the floor. I replayed the conversation once, then let it go. There was no point in rehearsing words that had already landed. I knew how this story would be told if it left my mouth and traveled through his. A stubborn mother, a concerned son, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. People would nod sympathetically. They always do when the story sounds familiar enough. What mattered wasn't how it would sound. What mattered was what it was. That night, I wrote down everything that had been said, not because I planned to use it, but because I wanted it recorded somewhere other than my head. Words have a way of shifting when they're only remembered. On paper, they stay put. As I wrote, I noticed something else. He hadn't once asked me what I wanted going forward. Not my plans, not my wishes, not my fears, only why I'd disrupted his. That, more than anything, confirmed what I'd already decided. This wasn't about saving our relationship by talking it through. It was about deciding whether I would continue to play a role that required my silence or step into one that required my resolve. I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer with the others. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel like waiting. It felt like a line drawn, clean and deliberate, between the life I'd been living and the one I was no longer willing to surrender. After that Sunday, the space between us didn't fill back in the way it used to. There were no daily calls, no casual drop-ins, no small errands disguised as concern. The silence arrived slowly, then settled, as if it had always been waiting its turn. I noticed it most in the mornings, when my phone stayed dark on the kitchen counter while I drank my coffee. I noticed it in the evenings, when I locked the door without wondering whether someone else had already decided to come by. I didn't reach out to explain myself again. Explanations had done all they were ever going to do. They'd clarified my position, not changed his. Instead, I turned my attention to the parts of my life I hadn't looked at closely in years. Not out of anger, out of necessity. The attorney called midweek to tell me the equity line was officially frozen pending closure. She explained the next steps, the paperwork that would follow, the timeline. I listened, asked questions, wrote everything down. When we hung up, I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not relief. Relief suggests an ending. This felt more like alignment, like pieces that had been forced into the wrong shape, finally settling where they belonged. I spent the next few days reviewing things I'd avoided for a long time. My will, my beneficiary designations, the emergency contacts listed everywhere from the doctor's office to the pharmacy. Each document carried assumptions I'd never questioned. Of course my son would handle things. Of course he'd know what I wanted. Of course he'd do what was best. Of course is a dangerous word. It asks nothing and demands everything. I made an appointment with the attorney to update my estate plan. When she asked how I wanted to proceed, I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to punish my son or make a statement that would echo after I was gone. I wanted clarity. I wanted boundaries that didn't depend on anyone's interpretation of my intentions. We talked through options slowly: trusts, directives, safeguards. She explained how easy it was for adult children to slide into control under the guise of care, how often she saw cases like mine. I listened, but I didn't let myself take comfort in being typical. I wasn't interested in being understood. I was interested in being protected. When the conversation turned to beneficiaries, I paused. For years, I'd assumed everything would go to my son. That was the unspoken rule. Parents build, children inherit. It's simple, until it isn't. I don't want to do it that way anymore, I said. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded and asked what I wanted instead. I told her about the cafeteria workers I'd supervised for decades. The women who showed up sick because missing a day meant missing rent. The men who took second jobs without telling anyone because pride mattered as much as survival. The kids who came through the line every day pretending they weren't hungry, and the quiet ways we learned to feed them anyway. I want to set up a scholarship, I said. Something for people like that, the ones who hold things together and never get noticed. She smiled then, not politely, but with something like recognition. We can do that, she said. It felt right, in a way I hadn't expected, not as a gesture against my son, but as a choice toward something else, toward a future that reflected the life I'd actually lived, not the role I was supposed to play at the end of it. I didn't tell my son about the changes, not because I wanted to hide them, but because they weren't his to approve. I was done announcing my decisions to see how they landed. I was done bracing for reactions that never quite came. Weeks passed. He called once, briefly, asked how I was. I said fine. He didn't ask anything else. The conversation ended where it began, neutral, careful, unfinished. I felt the loss of him in small, sharp moments. When I saw something at the store I knew he liked. When I reached for my phone out of habit, then stopped. Grief doesn't always come from death. Sometimes it comes from the realization that a relationship only worked when one person stayed smaller than they really were. But alongside that grief was something steadier, a sense of ownership I hadn't felt in years. I scheduled my own appointments. I changed my locks. I made plans without checking in first. None of it felt rebellious. It felt overdue. One afternoon, I drove to the community college across town and sat in on an information session about auditing classes. Nothing fancy. Local history, basic writing, things I'd always been curious about but never had time for. I signed up for a class starting in the fall, paid the fee myself, wrote the date in my calendar. When I got home, I stood in the doorway of the house and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. The furniture was old. The paint needed touching up. The place carried the marks of a long life lived carefully. It wasn't impressive. It was mine. That night, I slept through until morning. I knew then that this was the real turning point. Not the argument, not the paperwork, not even the evidence. It was the moment I stopped framing my choices as reactions to his behavior and started seeing them as expressions of my own values. I wasn't reclaiming my life to prove him wrong. I was reclaiming it because it was still mine to live. And whatever story he told himself about that, about me being stubborn, ungrateful, difficult, was no longer something I needed to correct. I had spent too many years managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. This wasn't justice in the way people like to see it. There were no winners and losers, no public reckoning. It was quieter than that, more final. I had stepped out of the role that required my silence and into one that required my consent. And once you do that, you can't pretend you don't know the difference anymore. The cost of that decision didn't arrive all at once either. It came the way real consequences usually do, quietly, in places where no one else could see them, in the empty spaces where a voice used to be, in the pauses that followed habits I hadn't yet unlearned. At first, I told myself the distance was temporary, that he just needed time to cool off, to recalibrate, to understand that I hadn't rejected him, only the version of care that erased me. I held on to that thought longer than I should have, because letting go of it felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to name. Days turned into weeks, weeks into a month. The calls didn't come back. Holidays passed with polite text messages instead of plans. "Hope you're doing well. Just checking in." Words that hovered on the surface and never went anywhere deeper. I answered in kind, cordial, brief, safe. People noticed, of course. They always do. Carol asked one afternoon if my son was out of town again. She said it casually, the way people ask about weather. I told her he'd been busy. That answer seemed to satisfy her. And for a moment, I was grateful. I wasn't ready to explain something that didn't have a neat explanation. How do you tell someone that the relationship didn't end with a fight, but with a boundary? At church, I sat alone more often. Not isolated, exactly, but unaccompanied in a way I wasn't used to. I watched families slide into pews together, adult children leaning in to whisper to their parents, grandchildren tugging at sleeves. I felt the absence like a bruise you keep pressing just to confirm it's still there. There were nights when I questioned myself, not because I thought I was wrong, but because loneliness has a way of making even the right decisions feel expensive. I replayed the conversation at the kitchen table, wondering if there was a sentence I could have softened, a moment I could have handled differently. Maybe if I'd explained more, maybe if I'd waited longer, maybe if I'd accepted just a little bit less autonomy in exchange for a little more connection. Those thoughts always ended the same way, with the memory of that line in the email, "She won't need to be involved." Once you've seen yourself described that way, you can't unsee it. You can't build closeness on top of that kind of erasure. I started filling my time differently, not to distract myself, but to anchor myself. I attended the class at the community college twice a week, sitting in a room full of people who didn't know my history or my family dynamics. To them, I was just another student, taking notes, asking questions, contributing when I had something to say. No one spoke for me. No one decided what I could handle. That mattered more than I expected. I also began volunteering again, this time at the food pantry instead of the school. The work was familiar, sorting cans, stocking shelves, offering quiet assistance without making anyone feel small. It reminded me who I'd been long before I became someone's mother, long before my worth was measured by how useful I was to my own child. There were moments of unexpected relief. The absence of constant check-ins meant I could sit with my own thoughts without anticipating correction. I didn't have to explain my choices or justify my pace. I didn't have to preemptively reassure anyone that I was still capable. But relief and grief are not opposites. They can exist side by side, tangled and inseparable. One evening, I found an old voicemail while clearing space on my phone. It was from years earlier, my son's voice younger, lighter. He was calling to say he'd made it home safely after a late drive. "Just wanted you to know," he'd said. I stood there listening to it twice, then a third time, before finally deleting it. I cried then. Quietly. Not because I wanted things to go back to how they were, but because I finally understood that they couldn't. That version of our relationship depended on my silence, on my willingness to be managed for the sake of harmony. Once I'd stepped out of that role, there was no way to step back in without losing myself again. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness, it was the certainty that came with it. The knowledge that if I reached out now, if I apologized just to smooth things over, I would be undoing everything I'd fought so hard to reclaim. I would be teaching him, and myself, that my boundaries were temporary, negotiable, inconvenient. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. So I learned how to sit with the discomfort. I learned how to let the phone stay silent without reading meaning into it. I learned how to answer questions from others without oversharing or defending my choices. "I'm doing well" became both a statement and a practice. Some nights, I missed him terribly. Other nights, I slept better than I had in years. Both were true. Both were the price of choosing myself. I began to understand something I hadn't before, that being needed and being loved are not the same thing. That some relationships survive only as long as one person continues to shrink. And that walking away from that dynamic doesn't make you cold or ungrateful, it makes you honest. There was no dramatic fallout, no apology, no resolution wrapped in a bow. Just a quieter life, shaped by decisions that finally felt like mine. And as much as it hurt, I knew this too. The pain I was feeling now was clean. It came from loss, not from confusion, from absence, not from being slowly erased. I had traded one kind of safety for another. I had chosen clarity over comfort, autonomy over approval. The cost was real. I paid it every day in small, private ways. But for the first time, I wasn't paying with pieces of myself I couldn't afford to lose. By the time winter came back around, I had stopped waiting for things to change. Not in a bitter way, just in the quiet acceptance that settles in when you finally understand the shape of your life as it is, not as you hoped it would become. The house moved through the seasons the way it always had. Leaves piled up along the fence in the fall. Frost traced thin lines across the windows in the mornings. I learned which rooms held the cold the longest, and which ones warmed quickly when the sun came through. These were small things, but they were mine to notice. Mine to adjust to without anyone else stepping in ahead of me. I finished my class at the community college and signed up for another. Writing, this time, not because I planned to do anything with it, but because I liked the feeling of sitting down with a blank page and deciding what belonged there. The instructor didn't know my age until halfway through the semester. When she found out, she blinked, surprised, then treated me exactly the same. That felt like a gift. The scholarship paperwork moved forward slowly, deliberately. I reviewed every document twice before signing. I asked questions. I made changes. The attorney didn't rush me. When everything was finalized, she shook my hand and told me I'd done something meaningful. I thanked her, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned, like my choices finally reflected the life I'd actually lived, not the one people assumed I should want at the end of it. My son didn't call when the holidays came and went. He sent a card, a generic one, with a printed message inside. I set it on the counter and looked at it for a long time before putting it away. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. I understood now that our relationship had been built on an agreement neither of us had ever said out loud, that I would always make room, that I would always defer, that my role was to absorb discomfort so others didn't have to feel it. When I stepped out of that role, the structure collapsed, not because I broke it, but because it couldn't stand without my silence holding it up. There were moments, still, when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I'd been too rigid, too proud, too unwilling to compromise. Those thoughts usually came late at night, when the house was quiet and the past felt closer than it really was. But I learned to let them pass without answering them. Doubt doesn't always need a response. Sometimes it just needs to be acknowledged and left alone. What surprised me most was how little drama there was in the end. No grand reconciliation, no final argument, no apology that tied everything together. Just distance, steady and unremarkable. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but doesn't go away either. And yet, within that distance, something else grew. I began to trust myself again. Not in a dramatic, life-affirming way, but in small, practical ways. I trusted my judgment when choosing how to spend my time. I trusted my instincts when something didn't feel right. I trusted my memory, my preferences, my ability to decide what kind of help I wanted, and when. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't affected by them. I stopped preemptively defending decisions I no longer doubted. When asked about my family, I answered honestly, but briefly, "We're not very close right now." That was enough. There is a strange peace that comes from no longer trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. One afternoon, months later, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had unraveled, sorting through old photos. I found one of my son and me, from years ago, taken at my retirement party. We were both smiling. I looked happy in the picture. He looked proud. The moment had been real. I didn't need to rewrite it to justify the present. I slid the photo back into the box and closed the lid. I didn't regret loving him. I didn't regret raising him the way I did. Those choices belonged to the woman I was then, and she did the best she could with what she knew. Regret wasn't the right word for what I felt now. What I felt was acceptance. Acceptance that love doesn't always age well, that some relationships are built for a season, not a lifetime. That stepping away from harm doesn't require proving that harm was intentional or malicious. It only requires recognizing that it exists. I didn't get justice in the way people like to imagine it. There was no moment where he admitted he was wrong. No scene where I was vindicated in front of others. No clear villain to point to. What I got instead was quieter and harder to explain. I got my life back. Not the version of it that included everyone else's expectations, but the one that fit inside my own boundaries. The one where my consent mattered, where my voice didn't need reinforcement, where my choices didn't require translation. I learned that dignity isn't something you demand from others. It's something you maintain by refusing to participate in systems that erase you, even when those systems call themselves love. I don't know what story my son tells about me now. I no longer try to imagine it. Whatever version he carries serves a purpose for him, just as mine serves one for me. They don't need to match for my life to be valid. On quiet mornings, I still make coffee and stand at the kitchen window, watching the light shift across the yard. The routine hasn't changed much. What's changed is the weight behind it, the knowledge that no one else is deciding what this moment means or where it leads. I am not reconciled. I am not restored to something I lost. I am simply myself again. And that, I've learned, is a form of justice that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for witnesses, and doesn't need permission to exist.